Today we are talking about social identities, and I'm going to be speaking about social identities within the context of the United States, because social identities are contextual, which is that they are given meaning within the context that they exist. We want to speak about it specifically within the United States. And the things that I'm saying may be more or less relevant to you depending on where you grew up and what your background is. So keep that in mind as I say some fairly general statements. So first, before we talk about social identities, we need to talk about social groups. And a social group is basically a group of people that you have something in common with. And sociologists consider a group 2 or more people, but here we're really talking about a big group of people who share a culture or a language or a history. And these are socially constructed categories, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a couple of minutes. For the purposes of this lecture, we're talking about social groups particularly around race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and things like that. So these are the identities that I'm going to be speaking about. These are fairly influential in our experiences on the whole. We all have all of these identities, even if they're not that relevant to us or we don't think about them that often. These are ascribed identities, meaning that we're born with them, but some of them are achieved, or some of them can be initially ascribed and then become achieved identities, such as class. So we're born into a particular class, but then we have social mobility in this country, so you can move up or down in class. It's not a static identity. Similarly, for disability or ability, you may not have any disabilities, but then you may get one at some point. Or you may have a disability, but then somehow it gets cured, or you have something happen that it goes away. Age is something that moves, right? That you're never the same age for more than a day, and so that's something that sort of, is ascribed. There's nothing we can do about it. It's involuntary, but it does change over time. Like religion is interesting because even if you're not religious, we live in a fairly religious, religion-identified society. Like a majority of Americans identify with some kind of religion. So even if you identify as agnostic or atheist, that's still an identity that would be given to you, or you may claim. So again, these are all identities that impact our experiences, whether we are aware of it or not. And I did add first language or immigration status down there because these seem to be fairly relevant identities these days. And if you're not a citizen, that can impact your life tremendously. And if your first language is not English, that also impacts your experience quite a bit. So, and then sometimes people ask about the difference between sex and gender. And sex is your ascribed sex at birth, basically when you're born, the sex that they ascribe you, which is generally female or male. But then as we get older, we may recognize that that isn't necessarily the identity that makes sense for us, and that is our internal sense of gender. And so those could be kind of in a disalignment in a way, and so you might identify as trans or something like genderqueer. And if you do have those aligned, so for instance, I was born female, I was assigned sex at birth as female, and I also identified as a girl and then a woman, that makes me cisgender, so CISGENDER. Okay, so group identity. I like to start this slide by saying social groups are social, which is circular reasoning, and I do that intentionally to talk about how, to get your attention really, to talk about the idea that in order to have meaning, there has to be contrast from another group. So a group is only a group because there's some other group that isn't that group, or there are others that aren't part of your group. So the contrast, which means there's like a social connection, basically, there's got to be some kind of social relationship, makes it a group, right? So we often know who we are part of, what group we're part of, by knowing who we are not part of, right? If that makes any sense. It's a social concept. There has to be a them in order to have an us. And we have, basically we have group identities in contrast to other groups that are different from us. So we may feel connected to other people because of our identities. We may feel a sense of nurturance or some kind of feeling of being special or a special affinity to people because of a particular identity. We may be drawn to those people. When you walk into a room, you may look around and think about who looks like you, who seems like you. Sometimes And we may associate more with those people than we do associate with people who are not like us. A classic idea is the sort of the kids sitting together in the cafeteria based on racial group or gendered groups, things like that. So again, as I said in the beginning, this isn't true for everybody, but it's true for a lot of people. And the other thing to think about is that our identities are really shape who we are. They impact our experiences in the world. People treat us in particular ways because of our identities when we move about through the world. So if I walk into a car dealer, I don't get to just be seen as a person. I'm going to be seen as a woman. I'm going to be seen as maybe somebody who has the ability to buy a car, if depending on how I'm dressed and how I present myself, right? And so these are generally larger social forces that impact us. So we want to be thinking about them. And oops, I wasn't quite ready for that. The other thing to think about is that we have, more or less of an affinity for these groups depending on all kinds of factors. So, for instance, I grew up Irish Catholic. Being Irish didn't mean a whole lot to me, just because, I think in my neighborhoods when I grew up, it was like everybody was either Irish or Italian or Jewish. So it wasn't like I was something different than a whole lot of other people, because there were plenty of people around me who had that identity as well. And it just wasn't that meaningful for us. It may have been different if I'd grown up somewhere else, or even someplace that being Irish is a really important identity. Like I think Holyoke has shamrocks in the streets, then they have a giant St. Patrick's Day parade. So I may have felt differently about being Irish if I'd grown up with that kind of thing going on around me. So it can be more or less of an affinity for us depending on all kinds of factors. So, features of social identities. These are sort of 4 ways to think about it. The first one is that they're historically situated, which means they are given meaning depending on the historical moment in which they exist. So, being a woman right now in this particular year is going to be different than it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even sometimes 10 years ago. Being a person of color, being a gay person, being a Catholic, any of these identities may be different depending on the era in which you're considering them. So that's going to impact your experience right now. If you're growing up right now as a young gay person, your experience is going to be very different than it was for someone growing up in the 1980s and feeling like that they wanted to come out as gay. There's very different experiences right now than it was then. The other feature is to think about that it's contextual. So the context in which it exists, said that this at the beginning, gives it meaning. So you're going to feel and be aware of your identity differently depending on where you are. So if you walk into a restaurant and you look around and you're the only person that looks like you, you're going to be really conscious of that, right, in that context. But then you may go back, to your neighborhood and feel like everybody looks like you. So if you walk into a classroom, if you're a man walking into a nursing classroom, for the most part, I think men are the minority there, you're going to be more conscious of that identity than you would be in maybe an engineering class where a woman would be more conscious. So you want to think about the context in which you're experiencing your identity. The other thing to think about is that these are all socially constructed, which means they're given social meaning by us. Think of construction workers. You're basically constructing meaning over time, which means that can change. And that sort of leads us to the next one, that's the identities are mutable, that they can change. The social meaning can change, and then also some of our identities can change. So I talked about you can change your religion. Sometimes people's gender changes. Your sexual orientation for some folks is fluid and can be different depending on different times of your life. Disability can change and age changes. So some of them are much harder to change than others, but they can change for the most part, most of them, not all of them. Let's see, I think that's enough to say there. The other thing to think about is that we have different experiences of our identities. The importance may be greater or lesser depending on all kinds of features. If you grew up very religious and it's a very important identity for you, that's going to be sort of central to how you think about yourself. That's going to be very different for someone for whom religion isn't very important, right? And that can change over time as well. So if you have a significant birthday, you turn 21 or you turn 30, you turn 18, any of these identities or those particular ages can have, importance, right? Because you're now an adult, or you now can consume alcohol if you want to in public. Or you think, oh, now I'm 30 or now I'm 40 and I'm really old. That can, have some greater or lesser importance in your own awareness of yourself. And that also leads us to awareness, right? It's going to be something that you're quite aware of, perhaps, and then not so much. That awareness changes over time, depending on what the identity is. So if you convert to a new religion, for instance, it's going to be really important to you, and you're going to be highly aware of that sort of newish identity. But over time, it probably gets integrated into the sense of self and becomes a little bit less, salient and really significantly in your awareness. If you have a significant disability that's visible, you may be aware of it almost all the time because when you go places, people maybe react to you because they see you in a wheelchair, or they see you using some kind of technology that's different from everyone else, so that may make you more aware. And this actually leads us into the idea of the looking glass self, where we learn about ourselves depending on how people, what they reflect back to us and how they interact with us. So your awareness can be different depending on what your identities are. The importance can be different depending on what your identities are, and those things can change over time. They're not static. And then we want to think about the impact of multiple identities, which is otherwise known as intersectionality. So you don't just get to be one identity at a time. I walk in, again, to a car dealer. I'm a woman, I'm a middle-aged woman. I'm, perceived as middle class and having the ability to afford a car. I don't just get to be one identity at a time. I can't walk around and just say, I just want to be seen as a white person today, or I just want to be seen as a middle-aged person today. You're all of your identities all the time, even though, again, your awareness of these identities is greater or lesser. So if you're heterosexual, you may not be thinking about it very often. If everybody in your family is heterosexual and most people you know are heterosexual, it's probably not something that you're aware of, and it probably isn't that important to you. So these can all be different depending on the different identities. Class is a really important one to think about in terms of intersectionality, because class can mitigate or sort of mediate the experiences of some of the other identities. So it's a heck of a lot easier to be an upper middle class person with a disability, or a woman, or who's gay, or who's a person of color. It doesn't take away the oppressions of sexism or heterosexism or racism, but it does make it a little bit easier sometimes. For instance, if you need prescriptions or technology to deal with a disability, or you need to get healthcare, or see specialists, it's a lot easier to do that when you are upper middle class or middle class even. So the intersection of disability and class can be really significant for lots of people. So again, it doesn't take away the other types of oppression, but sometimes it can smooth the way a little bit. So something to think about in terms of these identities is that some of them have access to social power and some of them do not. And we can mean a lot of different things by social power. And one way to think about it is access to resources that make your life a little bit easier, that enhance your ability to get what you need in life. Another way to think about it is access to influence over others. And sometimes that's even just by proxy, by seeing yourself reflected in the media, and knowing that, sort of your dominant group, the groups that you're part of actually make decisions or are represented regularly in a variety of ways in the media. So access to social power is generally limited to the groups that fall into the dominant groups, or called agent groups. Either one of these terms can be used. They're both problematic in various ways, but they're a place to start. So basically what we mean is the group that has access to social power. And these groups are generally valued, positively valued, socially valued, and they're considered sort of like the default group, right? So when you mention just a person, right, who do you think of? And depending on who you are and who's around you, you're going to have different ideas. But because the majority of people are white in this country, a lot of people think of a white person, right? And depending on the kind of status that you talk about, so if you say picture a doctor, right, a lot of people picture a man, right? Again, it depends on who your own person is. So if you said picture a dentist, I would picture mine, who's an Asian man. But other people might picture a white man, depending on who their own dentist is, right? But because of some of the media images that we see, we do have these default groups that come to mind when we mention certain statuses like that. So these dominant groups kind of define the norm. They're the standard by which other people are judged or evaluated, and they do have access to social power. And on the other side, it's this idea of targeted groups or subordinated groups, and these are the groups that don't have access to social power, are not represented regularly in the media in a variety of ways, are judged based on the dominant group's sort of status and what's considered normal for them. And so they're considered outside the norm, and they don't have that access to social power to influence other people. So these are the ones that we think about generally. And this is a kind of a binary way to think about it, but it's a place to start, and nothing is this clean or simple in our lives, but again, it's a way to think about it. Let's make sure there's not one more. This is all the ones that I want to talk about, or us to notice. So again, it's kind of a binary, and it's not always this simple and clean, so don't take this as, this is the way it is. But it is a place to start and a way to think about like who generally has access to power and who generally doesn't. And unfortunately, a type of oppression goes with each of these identities, which I'll go to in the next slide. But I do want to say that just because you fall into agent groups doesn't mean you feel powerful. It's not like, I have all the power in the world because I'm all of these identities. But it does mean that you are represented in our government, in our media, in our social structures, are seen as, again, the default norm. And just because you may have targeted identities doesn't mean you're powerless. It doesn't mean like that you're feeling inferior all the time. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that for some of those identities where you fall into the targeted group, you don't see yourself regularly in the media in a variety of ways. You don't see yourself in positions of power in the ways that other people do in the government and in social structures. So, and most of us have a combination of these identities. Very few of us are all of those, or all targeted or all agent. And again, even if you won the jackpot and you've got all agent identities, it doesn't mean your life is easy. It doesn't mean anything like that. It just means that you have access to social power in a way that people in the targeted groups don't. And the last slide, I think, is the types of oppression that each of these accompany these identities. We've been very creative as human beings and made up a type of oppression for each of these identities. And again, they look different depending on all kinds of factors. Yeah. The nativism idea is sort of the idea that the people who are native born to our country particularly, or anywhere, are better than or have more power than or are seen as superior than anyone who's been an immigrant. So, and linguicism is the idea that English is the best language, that everything else is inferior, that everyone should be speaking this language here, that there's somehow something wrong if they're not speaking English. And we've seen a lot of linguicism in places like, for instance, in Colorado, and I remember in California, there's a whole English-only movement where they didn't want any official government documents, to be available in any other language but English, and they didn't believe in bilingual education. They just felt like everyone should learn English and function in English, and no forms, should be available in anything but English. So ageism is really seeing that being young is the best thing. Not too young. Children experience ageism because they're sort of disempowered and not able to make choices for themselves often. We disregard the elderly in the same way, saying, they're not so useful to our society anymore, and they're mistreated in lots of ways. And so really that sort of middle age between 25 and 55 or so is really seen as sort of the prime age when people are really most valuable to our society. Classism is really against people who are poor or lower middle class even. I would include that in working class, and generally from middle class up. Even it's surprising because you would think middle classes maybe are oppressed by the people who are really, really wealthy, but I think middle class is seen as sort of the norm in our society. It's expected you're middle class, so I see actually that as an agent group, but that certainly could be something we talk about. Anti-Semitism is particularly around Jewish people. Some people say it's the oldest form of oppression that exists. And religious oppression is more inclusive, to exclude Muslims and anybody else who's not Christian, basically. Hindus, things like that. So the dominant group with religion is Christianity. And a majority of Americans identify as some form of Christianity. So heterosexism and homophobia is really against gay, lesbian, bisexual people, and heterosexual people are considered the norm. Trans oppression, transphobia against trans people, people who are outside the expectations of our gender expectations. Sexism is particularly against women, and racism is particularly against people of color. So I've kept this under 20 minutes. Hopefully you got something out of this. And again, not everything is cut and dry. There's certainly things here that are up for debate, and but it's a place to start. And again, speaking in generalities, these are sort of some ideas to think about when we think about social identities.